Okay, I'm going to talk about fear and empathy. So, these are two kind of emotions that we use to guide our responses to things, right? So, in this particular video, I'm going to talk about how fear and empathy guide our responses to our opposition's behaviors, okay? So, say we have an opposition that fears another group, okay? So in this case, we'll provide an example, okay? Anti-vax versus pro-vax. Okay, so in this case, the pro-vaxxers fear the anti-vaxxers because they're not getting vaccines, and in theory, that will lead to more disease and more deaths, right? Now, if the pro-vaxxers respond and allow fear to guide their response to the anti-vaxxers, what's that going to look like? Well, it's going to look like the pro-vaxxers trying to control the anti-vaxxers, right? Control is what ultimately eases the fear, okay? They're going to try to control the anti-vaxxers by making them get vaccines, right? And this is what happened during the COVID pandemic. We had the government who mandated vaccines for government employees, and the social movement behind the pro-vax people, right? It spread that vaccine mandate to private companies, right? So now there's a social movement, and large corporations that are private are now also demanding employees get vaccinated. Okay, what does this do to the anti-vaxxers? Well, it makes them fearful, right? So the pro-vaxxers, they used fear to guide their response to try to control the anti-vaxxers. And the result is that the anti-vaxxers are now more fearful as well. Okay, so if you're forcing, again, in this case of the government mandates, you're forcing people to get a vaccine or else they get fired, right? And they lose their economic stability. And in the case of private businesses, if you're an employee working for a private business and you are forced to get a vaccine, otherwise you get fired, you get laid off, then again, you're getting threatened with economic instability if you don't get this vaccine. This creates fear among the anti-vaxxers. And this fear is ultimately going to lead to the anti-vaxxers attempting to control or to lash out at the pro-vaxxers. Okay, and what does this look like? Well, this looks like all of the people going around coughing in the faces of pro-vaxxers, right? It looks like all of the people not wearing masks just to spite the anti-vaxxers, or the pro-vaxxers, excuse me. This is what happens when you allow fear to guide your responses to your behavioral opposition. Okay, when you fear the behaviors of somebody else and you use fear to guide your responses, you're going to create more fear in your opposition, and then they're going to flip the fear back on you. They're going to try to control you or spite you, and then you're going to end up doing the same thing to them. Fear is a disease in this way, okay? It spreads back and forth between two opposing groups. If you allow fear to be if you allow fear to guide how you control your opposition. Now, let's take empathy. Let's imagine that instead you used empathy to guide your response to your opposition. What would this look like? Well, instead of trying to force your opposition to get vaccinated, a pro-vaxxer would instead ask themselves why their opposition is fearful of the vaccine. And I'll tell you right now, I'll tell you exactly why it is. The government and the pharmaceutical companies, they're working together. The government pays billions of tax dollars to these pharmaceutical companies to manufacture these vaccines, and yet we don't even have universal health care, okay? So the government here is pretending to care about public health, but they don't care about public health, because if they did, they would pass universal health care. They would provide health care to the entire country. Instead, there's $1 trillion in medical debt, right? And the anti-vaxxers see this, and they're like, this vaccine can not possibly be good for me, because nothing, because the government has proven they don't care about public health. So what you're actually seeing here is just distrust in the government and the pharmaceutical companies. They're using our tax dollars without our consent to pay the pharmaceutical companies to manufacture vaccines. Meanwhile, they won't pay for doctor's visits, for checkups. The point here is that if the pro-vaxxers looked at the anti-vaxxers under this empathetic lens, or through this empathetic lens, rather than through this fear lens, then what they would see is, what they would gain is an understanding of how the anti-vaxxers are thinking and why they are thinking that way. What this allows them to do then is it allows the pro-vaxxers to take steps to address the catalyst of the distrust. Okay, the catalyst of the distrust that the anti-vaxxers have in the government and the pharmaceutical companies. And what would addressing the catalyst look like? Well, it would look like universal health care. It would look like less political corruption. It would look like less corporate corruption, especially in the pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare industry. No, but instead, we use fear to guide our decisions as to how to fix this problem, this anti-vaxxer problem, right? And the end result is that there's probably more anti-vaxxers now than there's ever been. So using fear to guide your decisions only makes things worse. Again, fear is a disease. It spreads back and forth between two opposing groups. And again, this anti-vax versus pro-vax scenario, this is just one example. Let's think about a bigger example. What happens when the United States, they get attacked, 9/11 occurs, and then we go into the Middle East and attack all of these families, and we try to attack the people who attacked us, but in the process we kill hundreds of thousands of civilians. What is the result of this? Well, we just created a bunch of new generations who are going to hate the United States for their entire lives. Okay, again, fear creates more fear, and then two opposing groups, they will continue to spite each other back and forth until one side gains the upper hand. This is not how you solve problems in the long term. This is how you create long-term problems. So we need to use empathy. And maybe you think I sound like a child when I say that, but I'm sorry, it's just the logical solution. We need to be empathetic of our opposition and understand and seek to understand why they despise you or why they have distrust in a certain government. Otherwise, we find ourselves in vicious cycles of war, or vicious cycles of division between anti-vaxxers and pro-vaxxers, or gender divides, racial divides, cultural divides. It doesn't matter. Bottom line is that if we continue to allow fear to guide our decisions, we're going to create more fear. Okay, this is how the human psyche works. If somebody attacks you, you're going to first defend yourself, and then you're going to look to control the opposition in such a way that eases the fear of future attacks, right? And that means offensive. It means you're going to go on the offensive. This is how war works. It's how every conflict works. Fear leads to more conflict, and the end result is everyone loses. Everyone loses in the long run. It's just basic psychology here. And the fact that this concept is not more mainstream just proves to us how sick we are and how incapable rather we are of thinking critically and thinking logically about our decisions. I don't know. This is such an important conversation, and yet there's like a handful of psychologists talking about this, a handful of people who actually understand it. It seems like, if you look at Gabor Mate, he's I'll link a video in the description. He discusses the difference between addressing catalysts and addressing symptomatic individuals, and that's basically what the difference between fear responses and empathetic responses are. If we blame individuals we try to fix the individuals. We try to, if the pro-vaxxers blame the anti-vaxxers, and they try to fix the individuals by vaccinating them, you don't fix the source of the problem. You don't fix the reason why they're afraid of the vaccines in the first place. Again, it's like love or hate. It literally is the difference between love and hate. Do you want to encourage loving responses, or do you want to encourage hate? It's common sense if you want to create a world that works long term for everybody. And like I said, everybody loses when you choose fear to guide your responses. Everybody. It can be hard to step up and be the bigger person and put your fears behind you, but ultimately you have to do it. And when both sides of a divide choose empathy rather than fear, and they ease their fears, you create very powerful movements, okay, that change the course of the world. This is what we have to do as a nation, and even internationally. You have to stop fearing China. You have to stop fearing Russia. You have to start empathizing with them, and you have to try to understand why they do the things they do, and you have to realize that you and your part in this divide played a role. You can't just completely put your blinders on and ignore the fact that you played a role in the fact that Russia is invading Ukraine. I mean, it's like we have, and that's another example. Again, the U.S. has military bases increasingly surrounding Russia. We're building more right now as we speak. And the end result is that Russia feels threatened. They feel fearful, and their response is to expand and to ensure that NATO doesn't expand into Ukraine and put a nuclear silo right on the edge of Russia's border. It's like Russia fears the U.S. and the U.S. fears Russia, and neither side is willing to concede to the fact that the reason they are starting these wars around the world, these proxy wars, is because they are fearful of each other. Instead, if they just both recognize that if they both become empathetic of each other's fear, and what would happen is they would understand each other, and maybe they could come to a peace deal. This is how we globalize the world, but instead we're creating proxy wars and trade wars that lead to supply chain disruptions, and ultimately everyone gets hurt in the process. The United States public is paying up for all of this inflation caused by the supply chain disruptions in Ukraine, and we're drawing all of these resources away from U.S. citizens, and we're paying to fund Ukraine, right? And it's creating social strife in the United States. And meanwhile, Russia, the citizens in Russia, there's social strife there as well. There's social strife in Ukraine. There are Ukrainians who are trying to escape Ukraine because they don't want to fight Russia. They'd rather just leave, and I don't blame them. Why would you? I mean, it's just land at the end of the day. It's like, if you can get your family and get the hell out, that's exactly what I would do. It's like I don't care about the land and the house as nearly as much as I do as surviving with your loved ones, and that's what matters. And that's the thing. I mean, when we allow fear to guide our responses, we diminish the ability to thrive with your loved ones and well beyond that. It's like I said, fear is literally a disease. Okay, it spreads, it bounces back and forth between a divide between two groups until one side attempts to take complete control, or until one side does take complete control of the other. And then, I mean, that's called conquering, right? But there's a little, I mean, in particular, if we're particularly talking about the war aspect, I mean, nukes kind of throw a bit of a wrench in that conquering strategy, right? It's mutually assured destruction. And in the same way, if anti-vaxxers are going around coughing on pro-vaxxers, it's mutually assured destruction. It's like fear leads to all of these inadequate responses. And if we never figure it out, we're going to continue down these vicious cycles. We can turn these vicious cycles into benevolent cycles. All we have to do is respond empathetically. Okay, so you have to try to understand your opposition. That is the way that you change the world. If you don't understand why your opposition is doing something, you haven't thought about the divide. You haven't thought about your opposition enough. Okay, so just give that a little thought. Thanks for watching.